Flooding Boscastle was a big event for the area, and so a lot of money has been spent trying to bring the area back and to try and prevent future flooding. £5 million was spent on a new flood defence scheme. I'm just going to talk you through some of the things that they did. One of the things that they did is they lowered and widened the river itself. So where the river might have flowed a little bit like this, they made it wider and also deeper. And as a result of that, the river could physically hold more water than previously, and that's going to reduce flooding. They built a new flood wall as well, quite near the heart of the village, and the flood wall just aimed to stop any floodwaters from overflowing. They raised the level of the car park, so the level of the car park used to be right at the side of the river, and then when it flooded, there you go, when it flooded, a lot of the cars got washed into the river. By raising the level of the car park, it meant that not only was it less likely to overflow, but if it did overflow, the cars would not get washed into the river. Another thing that they did was they raised the height of the bridges to give more room underneath. A lot of these bridges were quite old and historic, so I don't think everybody was happy about this, but they could see that it did reduce the flood risk, because if this river was going to flood in future and carry trees and cars down it, it was more likely that that was going to go through the bridge rather than get stuck in the bridge. The last thing they did was they cleared vegetation from the sides of the banks, because some of the vegetation was a little bit older and more prone to be washed away, perhaps damaged trees, that sort of thing. Now, you want trees at the side of a river because they reduce lag times and they absorb the water, but you don't want trees and vegetation that's going to get easily washed in, because the more that enters that river, the more that river's going to overflow and the more these bridges are going to get blocked. Rivers overflowing in that respect, it would be a little bit like having a really full bath, full to the brim, and then sitting in it. The action of that tree going into the water is like you sitting in a full bath, it'd overflow. So you don't want anything at the side of the rivers that's going to flow into it too much, and that might mean actually clearing some vegetation from the very side of the river and encouraging more vegetation further on up the hill. Question 1. Why was the river lowered and widened? The river was lowered and widened to make more space for the river water, and therefore less likely for the water to overflow. 2. Why did they raise the level of the car park? Previously, when it flooded, the cars in the car park got washed into the river, which created even more problems of flooding, because they then washed downstream and got blocked under bridges. By raising the level of the car park, it meant that the car park was less likely to flood in future, and therefore there wouldn't be these problems. 3. Why did they raise the arches of the bridges? Well, the older bridges had got quite low arches, and so any trees and cars or anything that was carried by the flood got stuck under the arch and blocked it, therefore causing further flooding. If they raise the arch of the bridges, then in future, if floods happen, things that are carried by the floodwater will hopefully go underneath the bridges. Why did they clear vegetation from the river banks? Well, vegetation is generally good for flood prevention, but not if it's right at the side of the river, because vegetation right at the side of the river is likely to get washed into the river if it does start to flood. So they cleared vegetation at the side of the river, but not further on up the slope.